June 1944. A processing area behind Omaha Beach. A column of German prisoners, perhaps 200 men from the 352nd Infantry Division, is being marched in a long single file toward the rear. They have been walking for an hour. They are exhausted. Many are wounded. Most of them are young. Some are teenagers. And they have the look of men who cannot fully understand what has happened to them. But what stops them, what makes several of them actually halt in the sand until their guards push them forward again, is not the beach. It is what is on the beach. Trucks. Hundreds of trucks. Thousands of trucks. 2.5-ton GMC cargo carriers rolling off landing craft in an unbroken stream, their engines idling in the salt air. Jeeps bouncing over the sand in clusters of 4 and 5, driven by Americans who look barely old enough to shave. Half-tracks, ambulances, fuel tankers, mobile repair shops on wheels, bulldozers carving roads into the bluffs while the prisoners watch, and behind all of it, stretching back to the waterline and out into the channel as far as a man can see, more ships unloading more vehicles. Not a single horse, not one. A German Obergefreiter, a senior private, turns to the American guard, walking beside him, and asks a question in broken English that American intelligence officers processing prisoners along the Normandy beaches will hear in different versions throughout that summer of 1944. He asks, "Where are your horses?" The guard does not understand the question. He has never served in an army that used horses. He has never seen an army that used horses. To him, the question makes no more sense than asking where the army keeps its oxen. He shrugs and keeps the column moving. The prisoner looks back once more at the trucks and shakes his head. In his army, the army he has served in since he was drafted, every infantry division he has ever seen has had thousands of horses. The artillery that supported his position on the bluffs was pulled into place by horses. The ammunition he fired this morning was brought forward on horse-drawn wagons. The field kitchen that fed him his last hot meal before the invasion was a horse-drawn cart. In his world, an army without horses is not an army. It is something he has no word for. He is looking at something his training, his experience, and the entire institutional memory of the army he belongs to has not prepared him to understand. Because the army that captured him, the army of the Third Reich, the army that had blitzed across Poland and France and driven to the gates of Moscow, the army that the world's newsreels had presented as the most modern and mechanized force on earth, had entered the war with over 500,000 horses and would use roughly 2.75 million of them before the war was over. At any given time, approximately 1.1 million horses were in active German military service. 75% of all Wehrmacht divisions relied on horses as their primary means of transport. The artillery was pulled by horses. The ammunition wagons were pulled by horses. The field kitchens, the medical carts, the supply columns, the bakery units, all of it moved at the pace of a horse and the speed of a man on foot. The army that had taken him prisoner, the United States Army, would purchase nearly 2.4 million trucks over the course of the war. It would build over 637,000 jeeps. It would field an army in which every single division, every single regiment, every single battalion moved on wheels and engines. Not a single American infantry division in the European theatre relied on horses for transport. Not one. And the German prisoner staring at the trucks on that beach was looking, though he could not have known it, at the single most decisive material advantage of the entire war. Not the Sherman tank, not the P-51 Mustang, not the atomic bomb. Trucks. The war would be won by trucks. To understand how the army that invented blitzkrieg fought the Second World War with more horses than Napoleon had used to invade Russia, and how the army it dismissed as a soft nation of factory workers built a logistical machine that would bury the Wehrmacht under a tide of engines and gasoline, we need to go back. Not to D-Day. Not to Pearl Harbor. We need to go back to a Michigan factory floor in 1913 and to a decision that a former farm boy from Dearborn named Henry Ford made about how to build a car. Because that decision, made 30 years before the first American soldier stepped onto a European beach, is where the war was actually decided. This is the story of two armies. One was built on a horse, the other was built on an engine. And the men who rode the horses watched the men who drove the trucks roll past them into history and could not, to the end of the war, explain how it had happened. Every war is supposed to be fought with the weapons that matter most: guns, tanks, aircraft, ships. But the weapon that decided the Second World War in Europe was none of those things. It was a 2.5-ton truck with a 6-cylinder engine and all-wheel drive, built in Pontiac, Michigan, by the same men who had been building Buicks a year earlier. If that sounds like an exaggeration, it is not. Dwight Eisenhower himself said it. In his memoir, the Supreme Allied Commander listed the 4 pieces of equipment that senior officers came to regard as most vital to Allied success in Africa and Europe. They were the bulldozer, the jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 transport aircraft. He noted with some irony that none of them was designed for combat. The war was won by the machinery of movement, not the machinery of destruction. The truck Eisenhower was talking about had a name every American soldier knew: the GMC CCKW, called the Deuce and a Half for its 2.5-ton cargo capacity, or the Jimmy, a play on the letters GMC. The designation came from its design features: C for the 1941 model year, C for conventional cab, K for all-wheel drive, W for tandem rear axles. GMC produced over 528,000 of these trucks during the war, with total production of the CCKW family, including the amphibious DUKW variant, reaching approximately 572,000 units. They rolled off the lines at Pontiac, Michigan, and at Chevrolet's plant in St. Louis. They came in dozens of configurations: cargo carriers, dump trucks, fuel tankers, water tankers, fire engines, surgical vans, mobile workshops. Wherever the American Army went, the Deuce and a Half went first. The other legend was smaller: the 1/4-ton 4x4 utility vehicle, the Jeep. Born from a desperate 1940 Army specification and a 49-day prototype deadline, the Jeep emerged from a frantic 3-way competition between American Bantam, which built the first prototype and delivered it to Camp Holabird, Maryland, in September of 1940, Willys Overland, whose Go Devil engine won the final standardization contract, and Ford, which mass-produced the design under license. Together, Willys and Ford built over 637,000 Jeeps during the war. The Jeep replaced horses in everything from reconnaissance to supply runs to casualty evacuation. It was, in a literal sense, the one-to-one mechanical substitute for the animal the Germans could not give up. But the trucks and Jeeps were only the visible part of the advantage. Behind them stood something the German High Command never fully reckoned with: the American automobile industry. When the United States mobilized for war, it did something no other nation on earth could do. It converted the largest automobile industry in human history to military production. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, Studebaker, all of them turned their assembly lines from civilian cars to military vehicles, aircraft engines, tanks, and ammunition in a matter of months. William Knudsen, the Danish immigrant who had run Chevrolet and risen to the presidency of General Motors, was commissioned directly as a lieutenant general in January of 1942, the only civilian in American history to enter the army at that rank, specifically to oversee war production. His job was simple: turn Detroit into an arsenal. He did. The output was beyond anything the Germans had imagined possible. Over the course of the war, American factories produced nearly 2.4 million military trucks across all weight classes. They produced over 600,000 Jeeps. They produced about 86,000 tanks. They produced over 300,000 military aircraft. They produced 41 billion rounds of ammunition. The numbers are so large that they lose meaning unless you compare them. Germany, over the same period, with its entire industrial base straining under Albert Speer's total war production system, managed a total army truck intake of roughly 253,000 vehicles across the entire war, less than what American factories built in a single year. America was outproducing Germany in trucks by a factor that German planners had told Hitler was impossible. And it was not just the quantity, it was the standardization. The American deuce and a half was one truck, one design, one engine, one set of parts. A mechanic who had worked on a CCKW in Louisiana could fix a CCKW in Normandy with parts from a CCKW in Italy. The German army, by contrast, was operating a chaotic fleet of over 100 different vehicle types. Many of them captured foreign models whose parts were not interchangeable. A German mechanic looking for a replacement axle for a captured French Renault truck could not use a part from a German Opel Blitz, and neither part would fit a Czech Tatra. The Americans had solved the logistics of logistics. The Germans had not. Now hold that number in your mind, because we need to look at what the German army was actually using instead. A standard German infantry division in 1939 required between 4,000 and 6,000 horses to function. Colonel General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, estimated that each infantry division needed approximately 4,500 horses and 2,000 horse-drawn vehicles just to move its equipment and supplies. Those horses consumed roughly 53 tons of fodder per day, per division. A hard-working draft horse required between 12 and 20 pounds of grain or feed every day, roughly 10 times the food weight a human soldier consumed. Grass alone could not sustain a working horse. The army had to haul fodder forward in the same supply columns that were supposed to be carrying ammunition and fuel, and the fodder competed for space on the same roads and the same rail cars. The fragility of this system was profound. Horses could not be driven at sustained speed for days on end the way a truck engine could. They broke down faster than machines, not in the mechanical sense but in the biological one. A horse under heavy load deteriorated after as little as 10 days of hard work, and recovery took months, not hours. A team of horses pulling an artillery piece moved at a walking pace, roughly 15 to 20 miles per day on good roads. An American truck column on the same roads could cover that distance in an hour. When one horse in a harness team died, the entire team and its load stopped. When a truck broke down, the truck behind it went around, and the horses died in enormous numbers. Of the millions the Wehrmacht used across the war, the exact number that perished in service is uncertain, with estimates ranging from 750,000 to over 1.5 million. The German military maintained a vast veterinary infrastructure to manage this. At mobilization in 1939, every infantry division, every mountain division, and every cavalry brigade had its own veterinary company. German veterinary hospitals were designed to handle around 500 horses each, but on the Eastern Front they were routinely overwhelmed, sometimes treating 2,000 or 3,000 animals at once. A German veterinary officer observed that despite Hitler's marked opposition to horses, the number of horses serving with German forces in the East grew steadily as the war went on, an indication that the use of horses was a compelling necessity. This was the hidden architecture of the Wehrmacht. The newsreels showed the panzers, the propaganda showed the Stukas diving. What the cameras did not show was the reality behind the spearheads. For every panzer division racing ahead at 30 miles a day, there were 5 or 6 infantry divisions trudging behind at 15, their artillery bouncing on wooden-wheeled carts, their supply wagons pulled by animals whose great-grandparents had done the same work for the Prussian army in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Of the 264 German divisions active in November of 1944, only 42 were armoured or mechanized. The rest, the vast bulk of the Wehrmacht, moved exactly the way armies had moved for the previous 3,000 years, on legs and hooves. The blitzkrieg was real, but it was a spearhead, not an army. Behind the spearhead, the 19th century was still marching. The Americans knew none of this when they first met the Wehrmacht in combat, and when they did meet, the result was a humiliation that the United States Army would spend the next 2 years trying to live down. February 1943. The Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. American forces, green and badly led, ran headlong into Rommel's Afrika Korps and were shattered. 6,500 American casualties in 5 days, 183 tanks destroyed or abandoned. American logistics in North Africa were in chaos, not because the trucks did not exist, but because the system for using them had not yet been built. Supplies sat in depots 50 miles from the front because nobody had organized a distribution system. Units ran out of ammunition, while warehouses full of ammunition sat undelivered. The Germans looked at the wreckage and concluded what they had believed all along. The Americans had factories. They did not have soldiers. They had wealth. They did not have warriors. The Wehrmacht called them the dollar army, and the term was not meant kindly. But here is what you need to hold in your mind. 18 months after Kasserine, in the summer of 1944, the same American army would build a logistical system so overwhelming that it would move an entire army group across France, at a speed the horse-drawn Wehrmacht could not match, could not intercept, and could not even comprehend. What had changed was not the men. What had changed was that the machine had learned to use the machines. The Americans had spent those 18 months in North Africa and then in Sicily and Italy, learning, by painful trial and error, how to move a modern army. They had figured out how to stage supply dumps, how to rotate truck companies, how to run maintenance schedules, how to manage fuel distribution across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Every mistake at Kasserine became a lesson. Every lesson became a procedure, and every procedure was built around the truck, because the truck was the one thing the Americans had in unlimited supply. By the time the invasion of France came in June of 1944, the United States Army had become the most efficiently motorized force in human history. Not because of any single genius, but because the entire army, from the supply sergeants to the corps commanders, had spent 18 months learning how to turn America's industrial advantage into battlefield speed. The moment that machine revealed its full power began on August 25, 1944, the same day Paris was liberated, when the Allied armies racing eastward across France hit a wall. Not a wall of Germans, a wall of distance. The problem was simple and enormous. The armies had advanced so fast after the Normandy breakout that they had outrun their own supplies. The French rail network had been deliberately wrecked by Allied bombing before D-Day to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beachhead. The major ports, especially Antwerp, were either still in German hands or too badly damaged to use. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every ration, every bandage, for 28 Allied divisions, had to come from the Normandy beaches, and the front line was now over 300 miles away. Each division consumed up to 750 tons of supplies per day. Patton's Third Army alone was burning through 800,000 gallons of gasoline in a single day. The arithmetic was brutal. Without a solution, the entire advance would grind to a halt, giving the Germans weeks to fortify the West Wall and extend the war by months. The solution was conceived in a 38-hour planning marathon and launched the same day, August 25, 1944. It was called the Red Ball Express. The name came from railroad terminology, a red ball being a priority freight shipment that could not be delayed. The concept was simple. 2 parallel one-way highways, each reserved exclusively for military truck traffic, running from the supply depots near Saint-Lô to the forward dumps near Chartres. Outbound trucks used one road. Empty trucks returning for reloading used the other. Traffic flowed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no stopping except for fuel and flat tires. At its peak, the Red Ball Express put 5,958 vehicles on the road. On its single busiest day, August 29, 1944, 132 truck companies operating those vehicles delivered 12,342 tons of supplies to forward depots. Over its 83 days of operation, from August 25 through November 16, the Red Ball Express moved 412,193 tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment from Normandy to the German border. And here is the detail that makes this more than a logistics story. Approximately 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers. In the segregated Army of 1944, black soldiers were overwhelmingly assigned to service and supply units rather than combat roles. The men who kept Patton's tanks running, who kept the entire Allied advance alive through that desperate autumn, were men the army they served had officially classified as unfit for the front lines. They drove 18- and 20-hour shifts on roads cratered by bombs, in trucks with no headlights because of blackout regulations, through rain and fog and the constant threat of German air attack. They broke speed limits. They broke regulations. They broke axles and fixed them on the roadside and kept driving. A Red Ball driver named James Rookard of Maple Heights, Ohio, remembered it plainly. When General Patton said for you to be there, you were there if you had to drive all day and all night. Those trucks just kept running. They would break down, we would fix them, and they would run again. The magazine Time, covering the Allied advance in the autumn of 1944, called the Red Ball Express part of what it termed the miracle of supply. It added something that cuts to the heart of this entire story. It said that this miracle was in the American tradition, a tradition the Germans have never really understood. It was begotten of a people accustomed to great spaces, to transcontinental railways, to nationwide trucking chains, to endless roads, and millions of automobiles. That single sentence, written by a journalist in 1944, contains the answer to the question this entire investigation is built around. Why could the Germans not do what the Americans were doing? The answer was not military. The answer was not even industrial, though the industrial gap was enormous. The answer was cultural. It was civilizational. It went all the way back to a factory floor in Highland Park, Michigan, in 1913. In that year, Henry Ford introduced the moving assembly line to automobile production. The effect on the price of a car was volcanic. In 1908, a Ford Model T cost $850, roughly 2 years of wages for an average American worker. By 1924, it cost $260. Suddenly, a machine that had been a luxury for the wealthy was something a factory worker, a farmer, a small-town shopkeeper could own, and Americans bought them by the millions. By the mid-1920s, there was roughly one automobile for every 6 Americans. No other country on Earth came close. Britain had one for every 44. Germany had one for every 196. This was not just a difference in wealth, it was a difference in what ordinary people knew how to do. An American farm boy in the 1930s had grown up driving a tractor, fixing a truck engine, changing a tire on a dirt road 20 miles from the nearest town. He understood internal combustion the way his grandfather had understood a horse. When that boy put on a uniform and was handed a 2.5-ton GMC, he already knew how to drive it, how to maintain it, how to coax it through mud, how to improvise a repair with baling wire and a wrench. The vehicle was not a foreign object. It was an extension of his civilian life. The German conscript had no equivalent experience. Germany was a coal-powered, rail-centered economy in which private automobile ownership was a fraction of the American level. The average German soldier in 1941 had never driven a car. He had grown up in a country where horses were still a primary source of agricultural power, where the bicycle was more common than the automobile, where the roads outside the major cities were often unpaved. When the Wehrmacht handed him a truck, it was handing him something he had to learn from scratch. And when the truck broke down, as German trucks did with regularity because German industry could never build enough spare parts, the solution was often to hitch a horse to the front and drag it. Germany recognized the problem early. In March of 1939, Colonel Adolf von Schell presented the Shell program, an ambitious plan to rationalize the chaotic profusion of German military vehicles. At the time, the Wehrmacht operated 114 different types of trucks and 52 different types of cars, a logistics nightmare that made spare parts nearly impossible to manage. The Shell program aimed to reduce these to 19 truck types and 30 car types. It was a sound idea, But standardization could not manufacture an automobile industry that did not exist at American scale. Germany, in 1939, simply did not have the factory capacity, the raw materials, the machine tools, or the oil to build trucks in the numbers the army needed. The Shell program took effect in 1940, but never came close to closing the gap. After the fall of France, the Germans resorted to pressing captured French civilian trucks and vehicles into military service just to equip their expanding panzer divisions. They fought the rest of the war with a patchwork fleet of German, French, Czech, and captured Soviet vehicles whose parts were not interchangeable and whose maintenance was a constant headache. The American advantage was not that its generals were smarter about logistics. The advantage was that America itself was a truck. The entire country ran on internal combustion. The roads existed. The fuel existed. The factories existed. The mechanics existed, millions of them, in every small town and crossroads in the nation. Men who could take apart an engine in their sleep because they had been doing it since they were 14. When Eisenhower said the war was won by the 2.5-ton truck, he was saying something deeper than he perhaps realized. He was saying that a country had been building the logistical infrastructure for mechanized warfare since before the war was even imaginable. Meanwhile, the army that had invented blitzkrieg was being eaten alive by its own horses. The catastrophe began where it always begins, in German military history, in Russia. On June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, with approximately 3.5 million men, 600,000 vehicles, and between 600,000 and 700,000 horses. The front stretched over 1,000 miles. The objective, Moscow, lay over 600 miles from the German border, and the army that was supposed to cover that distance was, in its great majority, walking. Only about 1/3 of the invasion force was fully motorized. The rest, the infantry divisions that made up the bulk of the army, marched on foot at 15 to 20 miles per day, their artillery and supply wagons drawn by horses whose feed requirements grew with every mile the army advanced beyond its railheads. The Soviet railways used a wider gauge than German and European lines, which meant that German engineers had to laboriously convert every mile of captured track before trains could run. Until the track was converted, everything, every bullet, every shell, every tin of rations, every replacement barrel for a machine gun, had to come forward by road. And the roads in Western Russia were not roads in any sense that a Western European would recognize. They were dirt tracks. When the autumn rains came in October, the dirt turned to mud so deep that wagons sank to their axles and horses drowned in it standing up. The Germans had a word for it. Rasputitsa, the time without roads. Martin van Creveld, in his landmark study Supplying War, documented how the German supply system, a patchwork of rail, truck, and horse, was stretched beyond its capacity as the spearheads advanced far ahead of their railheads. Van Creveld warned against reducing the failure to any single cause, but the logistical constraints he detailed were damning. The army simply could not move enough fuel, food, and ammunition forward fast enough to sustain an advance across distances this vast. By October 1941, the tanks were out of fuel, the infantry was out of ammunition, and the horses were dying at a rate of roughly 1,000 per day in Army Group Center alone. The Germans tried to adapt. They seized Russian horses, small, sturdy animals called Panzer ponies, bred for the climate and the mud. But the Panzer horses were too light to pull a standard German 105mm howitzer, and the standard German supply wagon was built of steel and too heavy for them. Only after the Germans produced lighter vehicles or captured Russian wagons could the Panzer horses be used effectively. In just one summer month of 1941, German forces in occupied Russia requisitioned hundreds of tons of oats and hay from local farms just to keep their animals moving. Then came Stalingrad, and the trap closed completely. When General Friedrich Paulus began his summer advance toward the city in 1942, the 6th Army brought roughly 25,000 horses with it. As the campaign dragged on, The number of horses and draft animals accumulated between the Don and the Volga swelled far beyond that, with some estimates reaching 150,000. But horses could not be fed or grazed in the urban battle, and German command ordered the bulk of them sent more than 100 miles to the rear to save on fodder transport. When the Soviets encircled the Sixth Army on November 23, 1942, the troops were cut off from their own horse transport and could not have moved their artillery even if they had tried to break out. As the pocket starved through December and January, the remaining horses became food. Soldiers slaughtered them for meat. The Sixth Army's chief quartermaster signalled on December 7th that rations had been cut to between a third and a half, and that the lack of fodder meant the bulk of the horses would have to be slaughtered by the middle of January. Survivors described piles of hooves and abandoned saddles, marking where the animals had been butchered. A German soldier's letter from the encirclement described a curious odour that would stick to this campaign, a mixture of fire, sweat, and horse corpses. The irony was excruciating. The army that the world believed was the most mechanized force in history was starving because it could not feed its horses and could not move without them. The blitzkrieg, it turned out, had always been a thin mechanical crust on top of an army that still fundamentally belonged to the 19th century. The contradiction was never more visible than in June and July of 1944, when the Allies landed in Normandy and the Wehrmacht had to rush reinforcements to the front. The Allied air forces had total dominance over the skies of northern France. American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons patrolled the roads day and night, attacking anything that moved. And what they found on those roads was not the mechanized juggernaut of German propaganda. It was columns of horses. The 2nd Panzer Division, moving from its assembly area to the invasion front, was delayed for days because its horse-drawn supply elements had to travel by night to avoid air attack, and even at night the columns were spotted and strafed. Several infantry divisions lost so many horses to air attack during the march to Normandy that they arrived unable to move their own artillery without replacement animals. A Luftwaffe officer watching the roads south of Caen wrote that the contrast was surreal. Above, Allied aircraft in total control. Below, German soldiers trying to move guns and supplies with horses and carts, exactly as their great-grandfathers had moved them in the War of 1870. The Americans, by contrast, could move reinforcements and supplies forward by truck in broad daylight under their own air umbrella, at speeds the German horse columns could not match even at night without interference. The time advantage compounded with every passing day. By August of 1944, the gap between American mobility and German mobility was no longer a disadvantage for the Wehrmacht. It was a death sentence. And the motorization advantage did not only benefit the Americans on the Western Front, it transformed the Eastern Front as well. Over the course of the war, the United States shipped over 400,000 trucks and other vehicles to the Soviet Union under the Lend Lease program. Soviet factories, which had been evacuated east of the Urals in the desperate winter of 1941, produced fewer than 200,000 trucks during the same period. The American contribution was not supplementary, it was foundational. The favorite vehicle was the Studebaker US-6, a 2.5-ton truck built largely for export. Studebaker produced approximately 197,000 US-6 trucks, with roughly 152,000 going directly to the Soviet Union. Soviet troops loved the Studebaker. They called it the Studer, and the name became so widespread that Studebaker entered the Russian language as a common word. The Red Army mounted its famous Katyusha multiple rocket launchers on the Studebaker chassis, and the combination of American truck and Soviet rocket became one of the most feared weapons on the Eastern Front. Nikita Khrushchev, who served as a political commissar during the war, later reflected on what those vehicles meant. He said he wanted to stress the quality and quantity of machines the Soviets received from America, and asked plainly whether anyone could imagine how the Red Army could have advanced from Stalingrad to Berlin without them. He said he could not. He said Soviet losses would have been enormous due to the lack of mobility. Stalin himself reportedly sent a personal letter of thanks to the Studebaker Corporation. The German generals on the Eastern Front watched their Soviet opponents, who had begun the war with a logistical system even more primitive than their own, gradually transform into a motorized force riding on American wheels. It was a second front of trucks, invisible and decisive. And even if Germany had wanted to close the motorization gap, it could not. The reason was oil, or rather, the absence of it. Germany had almost no domestic petroleum. Its fuel supply depended on two fragile sources. The first was the Ploesti oil fields in Romania, which supplied a significant portion of Germany's crude. The second was synthetic fuel, manufactured by hydrogenating coal, a process developed by the chemical conglomerate IG Farben with massive state subsidies. At its peak in early 1944, German synthetic fuel plants produced more than 124,000 barrels per day from 25 facilities, supplying over 92% of Germany's aviation gasoline and roughly half its total petroleum needs. But the system was vulnerable. Beginning in May of 1944, Allied bombers systematically attacked the synthetic fuel plants. The effect was devastating. German synthetic fuel output collapsed from approximately 92,000 barrels per day before the May raids to roughly 5,000 barrels per day by September of 1944. The Soviets captured Ploesti in August. By early 1945, nearly 75% of what little fuel Germany had was synthetic, and production had fallen to almost nothing. In the final weeks of the war, there are accounts of German army trucks being towed by oxen because there was no fuel to run them. Germany's industrial base, though sophisticated, could not match American scale, and it faced impossible competing priorities. Every ton of steel that went into a truck was a ton of steel that did not go into a Tiger tank, a U-boat hull, a railway gun, or an aircraft fuselage. Albert Speer, who took over German war production in February of 1942 after the death of Fritz Todt, performed something close to an industrial miracle in squeezing more output from the German economy. Under Speer's direction, German armaments production tripled between 1942 and 1944, despite Allied bombing. But Speer himself understood the fundamental problem. Germany was a medium-sized industrial economy trying to fight a global war against the largest industrial economy on Earth. The historian Adam Tooze, in his study The Wages of Destruction, demolished the myth of an all-powerful Nazi war economy. He argued that Germany went to war from a position of relative economic weakness, not strength, acutely aware that its resources were dwarfed by those of the United States and the British Empire. German gross national product through the war years typically ran at roughly half the American level. American real wages in the mid-1930s were approximately 126% of the German level, reflecting far higher labor productivity. Remarkably, German civilian vehicle production was not fully set aside for war production until 1943, 3.5 years into the war. By the time Germany fully mobilized its economy, Allied strategic bombing was already beginning to cripple the factories. The comparative numbers are staggering. The United States produced about 85% of all Allied oil, with output rising from 3.7 million barrels per day to 4.7 million barrels per day during the war. Germany, even at the peak of its synthetic effort, never managed more than a tiny fraction of that output. The Americans were producing roughly 30 times more fuel than Germany on their best day. And the fuel poverty reinforced the reliance on horses in a vicious circle. Horses did not need gasoline. They needed oats and hay, which could be requisitioned from local farms. A horse-drawn supply column, whatever its slowness, whatever its fragility, did not consume the one resource Germany could not produce. The horse was, in a brutal sense, Germany's hedge against its own oil crisis, and it was a permanent ceiling on German mobility. The contrast with America was almost obscene. Germany was rationing fuel by the teaspoonful, while America was pumping it by the ocean. The German generals knew this. Every one of them knew it. And the record of what they said about it, in public and in private, is one of the most quietly devastating admissions of the entire war. Erwin Rommel understood the problem more clearly than perhaps any other German commander, because he had fought the materially superior Western allies in the one theatre where logistics was everything, North Africa. The desert, Rommel said, was a tactician's paradise and a quartermaster's hell. In the papers published after the war, he wrote with brutal clarity, "The bravest men can do nothing without guns. The guns can do nothing without plenty of ammunition, and neither guns nor ammunition are of much use in mobile warfare unless there are vehicles with sufficient petrol to haul them around." Rommel knew that the battle was decided by the quartermasters before the shooting began. He said so in those words. He knew that in attacking his petrol transport, the British were hitting the one part of his machine on whose proper functioning the whole of the rest depended. He knew that Montgomery's ponderous, methodical style of warfare would only work given material superiority. And he knew that Montgomery had it. The Desert Fox was beaten not by a better general, but by a better supply chain. At the strategic level, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, documented in his memoir how Hitler had fatally underestimated American industrial capacity. Hitler believed the Americans had not made any great sacrifices of blood in the previous war, would not withstand a trial by fire, and did not exist as a real people, but were merely a mass of immigrants from many nations and races. This contempt for American capability was not a casual remark. It was a strategic assumption on which the entire German war effort rested, and it was catastrophically wrong. The most revealing window into the German officer mind comes from a converted manor house in North London called Trent Park. Between 1942 and 1945, the British held captured senior German officers there in comfortable conditions, with chess sets, books, gardens, and generous exercise privileges. What the Germans were not told was that every room, including the bedrooms and the lavatories, was wired for sound. British intelligence officers, many of them German Jewish refugees who had fled the Reich, sat in the basement transcribing every word. The transcripts, combined with similar recordings from Allied listening programs, run to approximately 150,000 pages and form one of the most valuable primary sources of the war. In those unguarded conversations, the German generals returned again and again to American material superiority. They attributed Allied success overwhelmingly to the sheer abundance of equipment, of trucks, of fuel, of ammunition, of replacement parts, of everything. Their tone carried something that sounds in the transcripts like a mixture of professional respect and personal offense. They felt it was unfair. They felt that their soldiers, better trained and more disciplined, were being beaten not by a better army, but by a richer one. They were right about the wealth. They were wrong about what the wealth meant. Because the trucks were not just trucks. They were the physical expression of a civilization that had organized itself around the engine in a way that Germany never had and never could. Every GMC rolling off a landing craft at Normandy carried inside it a century of American industrial culture, from Ford's assembly line to the farm boy who could change a differential in a ditch, from the transcontinental highway system to the oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma that pumped more petroleum in a month than Germany produced in a year. The trucks were not a weapon, they were a country, and the final proof came in the place where the war should have ended, but did not. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Hitler's last great gamble in the West. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men, attacking through the same wooded hills they had used to shatter France in 1940. The objective was the port of Antwerp, 200 miles away. If the Germans could seize Antwerp, they could split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. That was the theory. The reality was decided before the first gun was fired, and it was decided by fuel. The German forces that launched the Ardennes offensive began with approximately 6 days of fuel. 6 days. The German plan, and this is one of those details that makes you wonder whether the planners had lost their grip on reality, explicitly depended on capturing American fuel dumps along the route of advance. The Germans were launching a major strategic offensive on the assumption that the enemy would be kind enough to leave his gasoline where they could find it. At first, it worked. The spearhead, Kampfgruppe Paper, 4,800 men and 600 vehicles, under Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper, overran a small American fuel depot at Bullingen and seized approximately 50,000 gallons, but it was not nearly enough. The Tigers and King Tigers in Paper's column consumed fuel at a rate of roughly 2 gallons per mile. The arithmetic was merciless. And the Americans, once they understood what was happening, made sure the arithmetic stayed merciless. At Stavelot, American engineers blew the fuel depot before the Germans could reach it. At the large fuel dump near Francorchamps, American troops set up a hasty roadblock and burned approximately 124,000 gallons of their own fuel to deny it to the enemy. Red Ball Express drivers raced through the night to evacuate fuel from depots in the German path, driving without headlights through snowstorms to move gasoline to safety faster than the panzers could advance to capture it. Piper's column ran dry at La Glaise. His tanks, including the 68-ton King Tigers that had been the terror of every Allied soldier who faced them, sat immobile in the snow, their massive engines silent, their fuel tanks empty. Paper abandoned his vehicles and retreated on foot through the forest with the survivors of his command. Behind him, along the roads his column had travelled, German horse-drawn artillery units were tangled with motorized supply columns in traffic jams that stretched for miles through the narrow Ardennes roads. The horses, struggling in the snow and ice, blocked the trucks. The trucks, out of fuel, blocked the horses. Some German formations in the Ardennes had more horses than German infantry divisions in 1918. The last offensive of the Third Reich was being strangled by the same logistical contradiction that had haunted the Wehrmacht since the first day of the war. Meanwhile, on the other side of the line, the American response was itself a demonstration of what motorized armies could do. Patton's Third Army executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war, pivoting 3 full divisions, 90 degrees, from an eastward advance to a northward attack, and driving over 100 miles through winter conditions in less than 48 hours to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne. This was only possible because Patton's army moved entirely on wheels, was supplied entirely by truck, and had fuel, the one thing the Germans did not have, in sufficient quantity to sustain the maneuver. When Patton was told that the relief of Bastogne would require a turn and march that most staff officers considered impossible in the time available, he is reported to have replied that his men could do it because they had done things like it before. What he meant, though he did not put it in these terms, was that a fully motorized army, with a functioning supply chain and fuel to burn, could move at a tempo that a partially horse-drawn army physically could not match, regardless of the courage or skill of the men involved. The contrast inside the Ardennes pocket itself was devastating. On the German side of the line, horse-drawn columns clogged the narrow forest roads, slowing motorized units behind them. Traffic control, already a nightmare in the dense terrain, became impossible when a dead horse or an overturned wagon blocked a single-lane road for hours. German officers reported that on some roads, the mixture of horse-drawn and motorized traffic reduced effective movement to barely 2 miles per hour. Some divisions spent more time waiting behind their own horse columns than they spent fighting. On the American side, once the initial shock of the surprise attack wore off, the response was mechanized and fast. The 101st Airborne Division was trucked from its rest area in France to Bastogne in a matter of hours. Ammunition, medical supplies, and eventually even food were airdropped by C-47 transport aircraft while the ground routes were cut. When Patton's relief column arrived on the day after Christmas, it arrived with its own fuel trucks rolling right behind the lead tanks. The Ardennes offensive collapsed, and in its collapse was the final, irrefutable verdict on the question that this story has been circling from the beginning. After the German surrender in May of 1945, Allied intelligence officers spent months debriefing captured German commanders. The debriefings, combined with the Trent Park recordings and the personal memoirs that German generals began publishing in the late 1940s and 1950s, created a record of how the German officer corps understood its own defeat. The striking thing is what that record reveals and what it avoids. In their public writings, men like Heinz Guderian, Friedrich von Mellenthin, and Hasso von Manteuffel tended to blame three things: Hitler's interference, Soviet numerical superiority, Allied air power. These were real factors, and the generals were not wrong to cite them. But there was a fourth factor that the memoirs consistently underplayed, that the Trent Park transcripts show them discussing far more candidly in private, and that historians like Adam Tooze and R.L. Donato have since argued was more fundamental than any of the others. The fourth factor was that Germany went to war as a partially industrialized economy, pretending to be a fully industrialized one, against an opponent whose industrial capacity was not merely larger, but categorically different. Germany could build brilliant weapons. It could build Tigers and Panthers and Me-262 jet fighters and V-2 rockets. What it could not build was the 10,000 ordinary trucks needed to keep those brilliant weapons supplied with fuel and ammunition. It could train superb tank crews. It could not train the tens of thousands of truck drivers and mechanics needed to keep an army moving across a continent. It could design the finest tank in the world, the Panther, and then watch that tank sit immobile in a French field because there was no fuel to run it and no truck to bring the fuel forward. There is a detail from the final weeks of the war that captures the entire tragedy. In April of 1945, the Wehrmacht still had functioning Tiger and Panther tanks in its inventory. Some of them had never fired a shot. They sat in their assembly areas, fully armed, fully crewed, unable to move because the fuel that would have powered them did not exist. Beside them, in the same staging areas, stood horses, the animals that the army had relied on from the first day to the last, still doing the one job they had always done, pulling whatever remained of the supply system at 4 miles an hour toward a front that no longer existed. The most technologically advanced army in the world began the war with horses and ended the war with horses, and in between it had proven that technology without logistics is a weapon without ammunition. The American advantage was not cleverness, it was depth. The United States did not just have more trucks than Germany, it had more truck drivers, it had more mechanics, it had more roads, it had more fuel, it had more factories to replace the trucks that broke down, and more steel to build the factories, and more coal to fire the furnaces, and more oil to lubricate the machines that built the machines. It was not a gap. It was a geological formation. The Germans were digging a tunnel. The Americans were an earthquake. And the men at the bottom of that system, the men who actually drove the trucks, the men who actually changed the tires and replaced the axles and kept the engines running through the mud and the snow and the rain, have largely disappeared from the history books. The Red Ball Express drivers, 75% of them, black soldiers in a segregated army, delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies that kept the Allied advance alive, and most of them came home to a country that would not let them eat at the same lunch counters as the men whose armies they had fed. James Ruckard came home to Maple Heights, Ohio. The trucks he drove helped liberate Europe. The country he came home to had not yet liberated itself. He and the thousands of men like him did the work that won the war, and they did it in vehicles they knew how to drive because they had grown up in a country that ran on engines, a country that had given them that one gift, even while withholding so many others. The motorization gap reshaped everything that came after. Eisenhower's experience with the Red Ball Express and the critical importance of roads is widely cited as one of the influences behind his championing of the interstate highway system in the 1950s. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which created the network of highways that crisscross America today, drew in part on Eisenhower's memory of struggling across the country in a 1919 military convoy that took 62 days to drive from Washington to San Francisco, and in part on his wartime observation of the German Autobahn and the Red Ball Express. NATO armies, after the war, were built as fully motorized and mechanized forces. The horse-drawn infantry division passed permanently into military history, and the Soviet Union, having learned the value of the American truck firsthand, closely modeled its post-war vehicles on the Studebaker US-6. The Soviet GAZ-51 and ZIS 151 trucks, which became the workhorses of the Cold War Red Army, owed their design philosophy to a factory in South Bend, Indiana. The German prisoner on the beach, the one who asked where the horses were, was not asking a foolish question. He was asking the most important question of the war. He just did not know it. The answer was that the horses were in his army, pulling his guns, hauling his shells, eating his grain, dying in his mud, and slowing his advance to the pace of an animal that had not changed its speed in 3,000 years. The Americans had no horses because they did not need horses. They had something the horses could never be. They had an entire civilization that had rebuilt itself around the engine, from the farm to the factory to the freeway. And when that civilization went to war, it brought the engine with it. The generals at Trent Park called it material superiority. Rommel called it the quartermaster's war. Speer called it a production gap. None of those phrases is wrong, but none of them captures what was really happening. What was really happening was that two worlds had collided. One world had mechanized its farms, paved its roads, filled its garages, and taught its sons to drive before it taught them to shoot. The other world had built a doctrine of speed on top of a logistics system that still depended on a living, breathing, dying animal that could pull a wagon at 4 miles an hour and needed to eat 10 times its driver's rations. The blitzkrieg was genuine, nobody disputes that, but it was a performance by the best 20% of the German army. The other 80%, the men and horses who made the advance possible by trudging behind with the food and the fuel and the ammunition, were invisible. And when the Americans, who had mechanized not just their army but their entire country, arrived in force, the performance could not be sustained. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps the story of the men who drove those trucks, the men who never got monuments or movie roles, visible a little longer. And visibility is the least they deserve. If your father or grandfather served in any branch during the Second World War, in any theatre, I would be honored to read their story in the comments. Especially if they drove a truck, fixed an engine, loaded a supply ship, or did any of the 1,000 unglamorous jobs that kept an army moving and fighting. Those are the stories that do not get told enough. Those are the men who won the war while the history books were busy writing about someone else. Subscribe if you want the next investigation. There are many more of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary men who did extraordinary things that never made the front page. The men who drove, the men who built, the men who fixed what was broken and kept the machine running. One more day, one more mile, one more delivery into the dark. They did not ride into battle on horses or in tanks. They rode in trucks, and the trucks won the war.